Barely 16 years after its founding, the Turkish Republic was still rebuilding from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. Its roads were scarce, its industry was nascent, and suddenly the globe was descending into total war. Look at this map of Europe and the Middle East in 1939. Turkey was caught exactly in the middle. To the west, the Axis powers were rapidly expanding. To the south, British and French imperial interests held firm, and to the north and east, the Soviet Union loomed large. The historical data from this period highlights the danger of this exact geography. When a nation sat between expanding superpowers, the result was catastrophic. Poland was carved up from two sides. Iran suffered a joint British and Soviet occupation. For Turkey, a single diplomatic misstep meant facing a similar multi-front invasion. The state's primary objective became singular: survival. To achieve this, the government adopted a strict policy of savaş dışı, remaining non-belligerent. They had to balance the massive gravitational pull of these surrounding factions without getting sucked into the conflict. The architect of this strategy was President İsmetİnönü. He calculated that the republic's nascent infrastructure and small industrial base could not support a sustained mechanized defense against a great power. The Turkish military in 1939 was vast in manpower, drafting over 1 million citizens, but it lacked the armored divisions and air support required for a modern conflict. A direct confrontation with a mechanized superpower like Germany or the Soviet Union would lead to rapid, devastating defeat. Because physical defense was technologically impossible, İnönü's administration had to engineer their survival through other means. They would use the strategic manipulation of international law to keep the war outside their borders. The strategy began with the 1939 Tripartite Pact. Fearing Italian expansion in the Mediterranean, Turkey signed a mutual assistance declaration with Britain and France. But the Turkish diplomats embedded a critical caveat into the text. Protocol number 2 explicitly stated that no obligation in the treaty could compel Turkey to enter an armed conflict with the Soviet Union. This legal loophole ensured they wouldn't be dragged into a war on behalf of the Allies, as it meant fighting their northern neighbor. By 1941, the German army's sweep through the Balkans placed the Wehrmacht directly on the Turkish border. France had fallen, and the original Allied pact offered no immediate protection against a highly mobile enemy stationed just miles from Istanbul. Turkey countered by negotiating directly with Berlin. They signed the 1941 Non-Aggression Pact with Germany, securing their western flank. Crucially, they included a clause preserving their existing commitments, engineering an overlap without severing their ties to the British. These overlapping commitments meant that if Germany invaded, Britain was legally obligated to intervene. If the Allies pressured too hard, Turkey could tilt toward Berlin. The administration maintained security by turning the country's geography into a liability for any aggressor. By entangling both factions in contradictory promises, they forced their enemies to choose between Turkish neutrality or a new, unwanted front against another superpower. This strategy extended beyond legal texts into the political economy. Turkey possessed a massive reserve of chromite, a mineral essential for manufacturing weapons-grade steel. In late 1941, the two nations signed the Clodius Agreement. Under this treaty, Turkey agreed to export tens of thousands of tons of this critical ore to Germany. The chromite trade served as a defensive buffer. By supplying Germany with limited raw materials, Turkey secured German-made industrial parts and anti-aircraft guns, while preventing a total economic blockade that would have left the nation defenseless. They simultaneously leveraged this arrangement against the Allies. Knowing Britain and the United States were terrified of German armament, Turkey used the Clodius Agreement to force the Allied powers into a bidding war, driving up the price of chrome and extracting even more economic aid. The government effectively leveraged natural resources into a form of passive defense, keeping major powers at bay without deploying a single tank. By 1945, the policy of non-belligerency had fulfilled its primary objective. While much of Europe lay in ruins, Turkish cities remained untouched by bombs, and its population survived the conflict physically intact. But this survival came with a severe diplomatic cost. The victorious Allies, frustrated by years of Turkish stalling and resource manipulation, viewed the nation with deep suspicion. Turkey found itself completely isolated on the international stage. The geopolitical landscape had also collapsed from a multipolar web into a stark bipolar divide. And right on Turkey's eastern and northern borders, the Soviet Union emerged as a heavily armed superpower. Following the war, Moscow escalated its pressure. In the 1945-1946 crisis, the Soviet government demanded territorial concessions in the east and joint military control over the strategically vital Turkish straits. The strategy of overlapping treaties required multiple, competing factions to work. Now, as this visualization shows, the grid of wartime pacts dissolved, leaving the country totally exposed to a single unidirectional pressure wave from the north. To counter this threat, Ankara was forced into a rapid pivot. They had to abandon their long-held balancing act and anchor themselves firmly to the United States and the emerging Cold War architecture, eventually joining NATO. The strategy of multi-directional pacts prevented physical destruction in the 1940s, but it also left the nation without long-term allies. Turkey ended the war safe from occupation, but immediately found itself on the front lines of a new 50-year struggle between the East and the West.